The millionaire, once so confident, felt terror chill him to the bone. The tiger now was not just a savior, it was a judge. With a deep growl that echoed through the night, the beast cornered the coward in the sticky mud at the edge of the tracks. There was no bloody attack, only the overwhelming presence of the predator, the silent promise of an implacable fate. Psychological fear was the punishment, the mud, his prison. There, immobilized and trembling, the villain waited, while the majestic tiger watched over the elderly woman, a wild guardian against human cruelty, until police sirens tore through the night silence, sealing the end of that nightmare and nature's justice. Sirens ripped through the night, no longer a distant omen, but an avalanche of sound and light that erupted over the track clearing. Powerful headlights swept the scene, transforming shadows into sharp outlines and revealing the surreal nature of the moment. Police cruisers and an ambulance materialized, their engines rumbling in unison with the pulsing blue and red lights that danced over the dense vegetation. The arrival of the law, however, did not dissipate the air of unreality, but intensified it. The first officers to disembark, armed and cautious, stopped abruptly. Their hurried steps became slow, almost reverent. It wasn't the millionaire immobilized in the mud that held them, nor the injured elderly woman on the tracks. It was the tiger, the majestic and imposing beast remained there, between victim and villain. A living sphinx, its golden eyes reflecting the flashing lights with a disturbing calm. A low, guttural growl, almost inaudible beneath the wail of the sirens, reverberated in the air, a reminder that, despite the arrival of civilization, nature still dictated the rules there. The young millionaire, once so arrogant, was now a pathetic, filthy figure. The mud, his sticky prison, held him with relentless force. His eyes, wide with terror and humiliation, fixed on the tiger, which didn't need to attack to inflict the deepest of punishments. The predator's mere presence was a psychological torment, a silent torture that stripped bare his cowardice. He tried to move, tried to scream, but the mud swallowed him, and the tiger's growl seemed to suck all the oxygen from his lungs. His designer clothes, now unrecognizable beneath a crust of dirt, were a mute testament to his downfall. The police officers exchanged glances, perplexity etched on their faces. Never in their careers had they encountered such a bizarre scene. An experienced sergeant with years of service etched into his tired features was the first to react. With a slow, deliberate gesture, he raised his hand, signaling his men to keep their distance. The priority was the elderly woman. With calculated steps, the sergeant began to approach, keeping his gaze fixed on the tiger. He spoke in a low voice, almost a whisper, in an attempt not to startle the beast. "Easy, boy. We're here to help." It was a risky gamble. An instinctive communication between species. The tiger, for its part, watched every movement, its muscles tense, but without immediate aggression. There was an ancient intelligence in its gaze, a tacit understanding that its mission was accomplished. As attention was divided between the beast and the victim, a crucial detail was revealed. The dog. The small, stray, previously tied next to the elderly woman, was now free, trembling but unharmed, nestled beside her. The tiger, in its saving fury, had broken both their ropes. The little dog, with a faint bark, seemed to thank its improbable liberator, licking the elderly woman's hands, who, despite the pain, managed a weak smile of relief. The elderly woman, Donna Elara, was in shock but conscious. Her tear-filled eyes fixed on the tiger for an instant, a mixture of gratitude and admiration. She knew she owed her life to that wild creature. Paramedics, with the tiger's silent permission, advanced with stretchers and equipment. The beast, as if understanding that the danger had passed and that humans would now take over, retreated a few steps, keeping its distance but remaining vigilant. Donna Ilara's removal was a delicate process. Carefully, she was placed on the stretcher, the faithful dog trying to jump alongside. One of the paramedics picked it up, calming it. As the elderly woman was taken to the ambulance, her eyes met the tiger's one last time, an almost imperceptible nod of the head, a silent pact of gratitude and respect between human fragility and nature's indomitable strength. With the victim safe, attention turned to the millionaire. Two police officers approached the mud pit, their expressions of revulsion evident. The sergeant gave the order, "Get him out of there." The task was not easy. The young man, in his desperation, thrashed, the mud clinging to every inch of his body. He tried to argue, to stammer excuses, but his words were muffled by the sound of his own groans and the oppressive silence of the tiger, which still watched him. With a combined effort, the police managed to pull the millionaire from the mud. He was a grotesque figure, covered in dirt and shame, trembling uncontrollably. Handcuffs were placed on his wrists, the cold metal contrasting with his soiled skin. He was dragged away from the tracks, away from the tiger, which now seemed to have lost interest. As the millionaire was led to one of the cruisers, the tiger, like a shadow dissolving at dawn, began to move. Without a sound, without a farewell growl, it turned and walked towards the darkness of the forest, its steps silent and majestic. The police lights followed it for a moment, but the beast merged with the night, becoming one with the wilderness from which it had come. Its mission was accomplished. Justice, that day, did not come from courts or written laws, but from a wild heart, a primordial instinct that refused to allow cruelty. The young millionaire, now arrested and humiliated, looked at the spot where the tiger had been, an inexplicable chill running down his spine. He knew that, somehow, that encounter would mark him forever, an invisible scar of his own wickedness. The night, once a stage for his crime, was now a witness to his downfall. The night, which had been a stage for unspeakable terror and an improbable salvation, now settled with a heavy, almost reverent silence. The sirens, which had torn through the air with urgency, began to recede, carrying away the injured elderly woman and the handcuffed villain. The intermittent glow of emergency lights diminished in the distance, leaving behind a track clearing bathed only by the faint moonlight and the flashlights of the few remaining police officers. The air still carried the pungent smell of wet earth, mud, and a subtle, almost imperceptible trace of the wild creature that had been there. The remaining officers, with their impeccable uniforms and previously rigid postures, now seemed disoriented, their gazes lost between the empty tracks and the darkness of the forest from which the tiger had emerged and to which it had returned. There was no protocol for this. How does one record a rescue orchestrated by a top predator? How does one explain to a superior that a tiger, seemingly out of nowhere, intervened to prevent a heinous crime? Incredulity hung in the air, denser than the mist beginning to rise from the damp ground. The sergeant, the same one who had attempted an instinctive communication with the beast, ran a hand over his face, a gesture of exhaustion and perplexity. He instructed his men to cordon off the area, to search for any traces, but he knew that the most compelling evidence had already vanished into the darkness. What remained was the mud, the tire tracks of the emergency vehicles, and the vivid memory of an event that defied all logic. The crime scene, if it could even be called that, was now a stage of mystery, an anomaly in police routine. Meanwhile, in the ambulance winding along the dirt road, Donna Ilara, despite the pain and shock, felt a strange peace. The small stray, now nestled in her lap, trembled less, and its gentle licks were a balm. She looked out the window at the darkness swallowing the forest, and an image repeated in her mind. The tiger's golden eyes, its silent strength, its wild dignity. It wasn't fear she felt, but a profound reverence. She had been saved not by a human hero, but by a primordial force, an unexpected guardian who had manifested in the darkest moment of her life. Life, she thought, had mysterious ways of balancing itself. Far away in the police cruiser, the young millionaire was a pathetic figure. The mud had dried on his body, forming a crust that itched and bound him, a constant reminder of his humiliation. His designer clothes, now unrecognizable, were a symbol of his downfall. The smell of earth and decay clung to his skin, and he could swear he still felt the tiger's warm breath on his neck. The physical terror had subsided, but the psychological torment was only just beginning. He tried to speak, tried to argue, but his words came out as muffled groans. The police in the car ignored him, their faces impassive, but their looks of contempt were sharper than any verbal accusation. He was a man accustomed to having everything, to dictating rules, to being feared and respected. Now he was a dirty prisoner, an exposed coward, and the image of the tiger, imposing and silent, would haunt him forever. It wasn't just prison that awaited him, but public shame, scorn, the ruin of his reputation. And all because of an elderly woman, a dog, and a tiger. The story, he knew, would spread like wildfire. A millionaire tying an elderly woman to the tracks, saved by a tiger. It was the kind of headline that destroyed lives, that became an urban legend. He tried to close his eyes, but the darkness brought back the image of white teeth snapping ropes, golden eyes fixed on him, the growl that seemed to come from the depths of the earth. He had underestimated nature, underestimated life, and nature had responded with a silent, relentless fury. As the cruiser drove away towards the city, the silence in the track clearing became almost absolute. Only the rustling of leaves in the wind and the distant chirp of a cricket broke the quiet. The police, after a fruitless search for any concrete clue about the tiger's origin, began to withdraw. The story they would take back for their reports would be incomplete, surreal, but undeniably true. That stretch of forest, once just a forgotten patch of woods, had become a place of legends, a sanctuary where wild justice had manifested. The tiger, the true hero of the night, had disappeared as mysteriously as it had appeared, leaving behind not just a saved life, but an unforgettable lesson about the fragility of human cruelty and the indomitable force of nature. The night, witness to everything, kept its secrets, but dawn would bring with it the repercussions of an event that would change many lives and make the world question the thin line between the civilized and the wild. Dawn, punctual and indifferent to the night's dramas, tore through the dark veil with shades of grey and pink. The pale light revealed the track clearing in a new way, no longer a stage of terror, but a site of mystery, where dried mud and tire marks were the only visible traces of a divine or wild intervention. With the sun came the buzz. The news, like an uncontrollable virus, was already spreading. There was no containing the bizarre. The first morning radio bulletins and online headlines screamed incredulity. Millionaire ties, elderly woman to tracks, saved by mysterious tiger. The words seemed to come from a fantasy movie script, but reality was stranger than fiction. The story, initially treated with skepticism, gained momentum with the testimonies of the still shocked police officers and the first blurred images from the scene. The young millionaire's name, once synonymous with success and ostentation, was now dragged through the mud of public shame. His fortune and influence, which he believed were impenetrable shields, crumbled under the weight of an unprecedented scandal. In the hospital, Donna Ilara awoke to a new reality. The physical pain was a constant reminder of the cruelty she had suffered, but the image of the tiger, majestic and protective, filled her mind with overwhelming gratitude. Her eyes, once tear-filled with fear, now shone with an almost mystical reverence. The small stray, faithful and vigilant, was nestled at the foot of her bed, a silent comfort. Doctors and nurses came and went, their curious glances mixed with professional concern. They asked about the incident, about the tiger, but Donna Ilara merely smiled faintly, her words few and laden with a meaning few could comprehend. She knew she had witnessed something extraordinary, an intervention that defied logic, but which reaffirmed the existence of a greater, wilder, purer justice. She felt no anger towards the young man, only a strange pity. Nature had exacted its price, and he would pay it in a way no human prison could replicate. Meanwhile, at the police station, the young millionaire was a shell of his former self. The mud had been removed, but the grime of humiliation remained. His eyes, once arrogant, were now sunken and filled with latent terror. With each question from investigators, each mention of the tiger, he trembled. He tried to deny, tried to minimize, but the evidence was overwhelming, and the vivid memory of the predator in his mind was the most irrefutable proof of his cowardice. He couldn't shake the sensation of the warm breath, the golden gaze fixed on him, the relentless force that had cornered him. Prison, the cold cell, the prospect of a trial, and the ruin of his reputation were terrible. But the real hell was in his own mind, where the tiger reigned supreme, a silent and eternal judge. He had lost everything, his freedom, his status, his dignity. But above all, he had lost his peace, condemned to relive that moment of terror, eternally trapped in the mud of his own malice. The police officers who had been at the crime scene struggled to write their reports. How does one describe a tiger that appears out of nowhere, saves a life, and disappears without a trace? The official version would be sanitized, stripped of its most fantastic element, but the truth, by word of mouth, was already spreading. The exhausted sergeant knew that the story of the savior tiger would become an urban legend, a dark fairy tale that would echo for generations. He wondered if there was a logical explanation, a circus, a zoo. But the forest was vast and wild, and the tiger seemed to belong to it in a way that defied any human explanation. The city awoke to the most unbelievable story in its recent history. In the streets, in cafes, in offices, there was only one topic of conversation. The millionaire, once envied, was now vilified. The tiger, once a threat, was celebrated as an unlikely hero. The thin line between the civilized and the wild had not only been questioned, but brutally severed, revealing that sometimes the purest and most implacable justice came from where it was least expected, from the depths of untamed nature. The stage was set for the trial, not just of a man, but of a society that needed to confront its own barbarity. The morning's clamor was not the song of birds, but the deafening roar of the media. Like a wildfire in a dry forest, the news spread, consuming everything in its path. Headlines, once confined to local newspapers and obscure blogs, now emblazoned the covers of the country's largest tabloids and news portals. The Justice Tiger and the Cowardly Millionaire, a story that defies reason, screamed one title, while another proclaimed Nature Against Cruelty, the predator who saved a life. The story was so bizarre, so fantastic, that at first many doubted. But the testimonies of the still, pale and confused police officers and the first images from the scene, the mud, the broken ropes, the tire tracks, were irrefutable. Public curiosity exploded. The internet was flooded with theories. Was it a circus tiger? A runaway pet? A forest spirit? The truth, however, was simpler and more terrifying. It was a wild tiger, and it had acted with a precision and purpose that defied human comprehension. The young millionaire, once an icon of success and power, became the villain of a modern fable, his name dragged through the mud of public shame. His image, once associated with luxury cars and exclusive parties, was now that of a dirty, cowardly man trapped in the mud. While the world buzzed at the police station, the millionaire faced a reality even colder than the cell. His lawyers, a team of sharks, accustomed to handling high-profile scandals, arrived with grave expressions. They attempted a pragmatic approach, discussing defense strategies, minimizing reputational damage, preparing statements for the press. But the young man couldn't concentrate. His eyes, once full of arrogance, were now empty, fixed on an invisible spot on the wall. He heard his lawyers' voices as a distant hum, muffled by the echo of the tiger's growl in his mind. "We need a story," one of the lawyers said, his voice polished and firm. "Something that justifies, that humanizes, perhaps stress, a temporary mental breakdown." The millionaire shivered. "There is no story," he mumbled, his voice hoarse. "Only the tiger." The lawyers exchanged glances. They were accustomed to difficult clients, but never one who seemed more terrified by a hallucination than by the charges he faced. The fear in his eyes was not the fear of prison or financial ruin. It was a primordial terror, terrified by something that they, men of law and logic, could not comprehend. He described the warm breath, the golden gaze, the white teeth, snapping the ropes with silent, relentless force. He wasn't just imprisoned, he was haunted. Far away in the hospital, Donna Ilara was an island of serenity amidst the storm of curiosity. Her room became a pilgrimage site for journalists and curious onlookers, but she received them with a dignified calm that disarmed them. Sitting on her bed, with the small stray dog nestled beside her, she spoke little, but her words were laden with ancestral wisdom. "It wasn't a man who saved me," she told a reporter, her eyes shining with a soft light. "It was nature. It has its own ways of delivering justice." She felt no anger, only a deep gratitude and a strange pity for the young man who had tied her up. She saw in him not just malice, but the fragility of a lost soul, consumed by his own arrogance. The tiger, to her, was not just an animal. It was the manifestation of a greater force, a reminder that the wild world still held its mysteries and its protectors. Her story, told with touching simplicity, resonated with the public in a way no sensational headline could match. She became a symbol of resilience, and the stray dog, a four-legged hero, her faithful squire. Meanwhile, the police continued to grapple with the bureaucracy of the extraordinary. The reports were a nightmare. How does one quantify the intervention of a top predator? The sergeant, who had witnessed everything, tried to maintain objectivity, but knew the truth was far more complex than the lines on a form. The forest around the tracks had been exhaustively searched, but no trace of the tiger was found. It had appeared from nowhere and vanished into nothing, leaving behind only the legend. The story of the savior tiger became a cultural phenomenon. Children drew tigers with halos, folk songs began to emerge, and even an online movement called for the protection of the forest where the justice tiger resided. The world was fascinated, not just by the absurdity of the event, but by the powerful message it carried. Nature, in its wildest form, had corrected a human injustice. For the young millionaire, every news report, every online comment, every scornful glance from police and lawyers was a nail in his psychological coffin. He had lost sleep, tormented by vivid nightmares of the tiger. The cold cell was not his greatest torment. It was the prison of his own mind, where the golden predator reigned supreme, a silent and eternal judge. He had underestimated life, underestimated nature, and nature had responded with a silent, relentless fury that would haunt him forever. The approaching trial would not just be about his crimes, but about the thin line he had dared to cross, the line between civility and savagery, and the price nature exacted from those who defied it. The cold, damp cell was not the young millionaire's hell. Hell was in his own mind, a stage where the golden tiger enacted its endless vengeance. With every blink, white, sharp teeth tore at the ropes, not of the old woman, but of his own sanity. The warm breath, once a vivid memory, was now a constant sensation, a chilling shiver on his neck, even under the police station's air conditioning. He saw the tiger in the reflections of the windows, in the shadows dancing on the wall, even in the tired eyes of the police officers watching him. It wasn't a full hallucination, not yet, but a projection so real it prevented him from distinguishing truth from the terror consuming him. His lawyers, men and women of steel, accustomed to shaping narratives and dismantling accusations, were lost. They tried to discuss strategies, the possibility of a plea bargain, building a defense based on stress and mental breakdown. But the young man merely shook his head, his eyes fixed on an invisible spot. "He's here," he mumbled, his voice a hoarse whisper, "always here." They tried to argue, to rationalize, but how do you fight a predator that existed only in their client's mind? His fear was not the fear of losing freedom or fortune. It was an older, more visceral fear, the fear of being prey. The legal team, once confident, now faced an ethical and practical dilemma. How could they defend someone who could barely articulate a coherent sentence, who was more concerned with a feline ghost than with his own future? The idea of declaring him legally insane began to gain traction, a last resort to save what remained of his reputation and perhaps his soul. But even this strategy was risky. Public opinion had already condemned him, and any attempt to minimize his guilt would be seen as yet another ploy by a rich man trying to escape justice. Meanwhile, the story of Donna Ilara and the Justice Tiger spread like a modern gospel. Her hospital room, once a refuge, transformed into a sanctuary. Journalists, curious onlookers, even religious leaders and environmental activists came seeking her wisdom. She, with her unwavering calm and the faithful stray dog nestled at her feet, spoke in parables, in simple truths that resonated deeply. "Nature does not forget," she would say, her eyes brimming with a serene light. "It has its own ways of balancing the scales." Her words, devoid of anger or rancor, were a balm for a society thirsty for justice and meaning. She did not seek revenge, only understanding. The tiger, to her, was not a monster, but a guardian, a manifestation of the primordial force that inhabited the forest. Her story inspired an unprecedented environmental protection movement, with online petitions and peaceful demonstrations calling for the preservation of the Justice Tiger's habitat. The forest around the tracks, once ignored, became a symbol, a sacred place where nature had spoken. The police, for their part, were under immense pressure. The official reports were a patchwork of facts and omissions. How could they include the appearance and disappearance of a wild tiger without looking ridiculous? The sergeant, who had witnessed the terror in the millionaire's eyes and the majesty of the predator, knew that the truth was stranger than fiction. Searches in the forest had been fruitless. The tiger had not left a single trace, as if it had been swallowed by the earth itself. The absence of physical evidence of the animal only fueled the legend, making it even more enigmatic and powerful in the popular imagination. The city buzzed with anticipation for the trial. It would not just be a legal process, but a media spectacle, a referendum on morality, nature, and humanity's place in the world. The prosecutor, an ambitious and pragmatic man, knew he had a complicated case on his hands. How could he present the tiger element without discrediting the entire process? He prepared to focus on the millionaire's crimes, on the cruelty and attempted murder, minimizing the fantastic aspect of the intervention. But the media and the public would not allow the tiger to be forgotten. It was the soul of the story, the catalyst for justice. For the young millionaire, each day was a deeper descent into the spiral of despair. Sleep was a denied luxury, replaced by vivid nightmares where the tiger repeatedly cornered him, not in the mud, but in the dark corridors of his own mind. He had lost his appetite, his ability to reason, even the will to fight. Prison, financial ruin, public disgrace, all of it paled before the constant and terrifying presence of the predator. He had defied nature, and nature in its silent and relentless fury had exacted a price that no human cell or judgment could equal: the loss of his own peace, condemned to be eternally the prey, haunted by the roar that only he could hear. The trial was approaching, but for him, the sentence had already been passed by the judge of golden stripes. The trial was approaching, but for him, the sentence had already been passed by the judge of golden stripes. In his cell, the young millionaire wasted away, a pale shadow of the arrogant man he once was. Nights were a torment, a dark screen where the golden tiger danced in his mind. No longer as a memory, but as a living entity. Snarling and prowling, he felt the invisible weight of the predator's paw on his chest, the warm breath on his face, the smell of damp earth and blood that only he could perceive. He began to murmur to himself, answering inaudible questions, debating with the feline phantom that imprisoned him. His desperate lawyers attempted a final intervention. They entered the cell, their impeccable suits contrasting with the disarray of the man before them. He was huddled in a corner, eyes wide, fixed on an empty spot. "Sir," one of them began, his voice cautious. The millionaire didn't respond. Suddenly he cowered, covering his head with his hands. "No, don't look at me like that," he shrieked, his voice thin and brittle. "I know what you did. I know." The lawyers exchanged panicked glances. There was no denying it anymore. Their client's sanity had shattered, splintered by the teeth of a tiger no one else saw. The insanity defense strategy, once a risky gambit, now seemed the only way out. But how could they convince a jury that the man was insane without it seeming like a convenient excuse for his heinous crimes? Public opinion, fueled by Donna Ilara's narrative, had already delivered its verdict. He was a monster, and the tiger his divine executioner. Far away in the hospital, Donna Ilara was the embodiment of calm. Her room, once a refuge, was now a pilgrimage center. The stray dog, affectionately named Feel, faithful by the hospital staff, never left her side, a silent guardian. Donna Ilara's story, told with the simplicity of a parable, had become a global phenomenon. It wasn't just news, it was a call. "The forest has its whispers," she told a group of visiting students, her eyes shining with ancestral wisdom. "And sometimes it roars to be heard." Her words inspired the creation of an environmental movement called Guardians of the Forest, which quickly gained strength, uniting people of all ages and social classes around the cause of preservation. Online petitions gathered millions of signatures, demanding immediate protection for the area where the Justice Tiger had appeared. The forest around the tracks, once a forgotten place, became an unofficial sanctuary. Tourists and curious onlookers, armed with cameras and hope, ventured onto its trails, not to hunt, but to revere. Improvised signs appeared, asking for silence and respect for nature. The tiger's legend grew daily, fueled by the absence of any physical trace. It was the spirit of the forest, the voice of nature, a symbol that savagery still held the power to correct imbalances caused by human arrogance. Meanwhile, the prosecutor, a man of logic and facts, found himself in an almost insoluble dilemma. How could he conduct a trial where the main element of justice was a mythical animal? The media and the public spoke of nothing else. Every newscast, every article, every social media post mentioned the Justice Tiger. He knew that if he tried to ignore the tiger, he would be accused of covering up the truth or of being insensitive to the popular narrative. If he tried to incorporate it, he risked turning the courtroom into a circus, discrediting the entire legal process. His team worked incessantly, trying to build a solid case based on forensic evidence and human testimonies, but the tiger's shadow loomed over every document, every strategy. The trial date was set, and the entire city prepared for what would be the legal spectacle of the century. It was not just a trial of a man, it was a trial of society, of nature, of justice in its most primordial form. The tension was palpable, an air charged with expectation and popular fervor. The streets around the courthouse were filled with protesters holding signs demanding justice for Donna Ilara and the forest, and long live the justice tiger. Security was heightened, anticipating the avalanche of media and curious onlookers. Reporters from around the world set up their equipment, ready to broadcast every detail of what promised to be an unprecedented event. The story had transcended the boundaries of local news, becoming a global symbol of the struggle between human greed and nature's resilience. For the young millionaire, however, the courtroom was irrelevant. He was already in a perpetual trial, presided over by a judge of golden stripes who watched him from within his own mind, condemning him to an eternity of terror and remorse. Each day, the roar grew louder, the teeth sharper, and the line between reality and madness thinner until it finally broke. On the eve of the trial, he was found in his cell, rocking back and forth, eyes glazed over, murmuring incessantly, "He's coming. He's coming." The prison doctor confirmed what everyone already suspected. The young millionaire had completely descended into psychosis, his mind consumed by the predator he had tried to defy. Human justice was about to begin, but his own, the cruelest of all, had already been imposed. The morning of the trial dawned under a gray sky, heavy with the expectation that hung over the city. The streets around the courthouse were a sea of humanity, a volatile mix of reporters with their cameras pointed. Guardians of the forest activists displaying vibrant posters, and curious onlookers hungry for every detail of the spectacle. Cries of "Justice for Donna Ilara" and "Long live the justice tiger" echoed, blending with the incessant hum of live broadcasts. Security, reinforced to its limit, could barely contain the tide of popular fervor. It was not just a trial, it was a moral referendum, a pitched battle between greed and redemption. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was equally charged, but with a more contained, almost suffocating tension. The prosecutor, his face etched with exhaustion, reviewed his notes for the 1,000th time, aware that he was about to face not only astute lawyers, but also the overwhelming force of a legend. He knew that every word, every piece of evidence, would be dissected under the microscope of public opinion, already predisposed to a verdict. When the side door opened, it was not the arrogant millionaire of old who entered, but a skeletal, pale figure with sunken, glazed eyes. He was handcuffed not for physical precaution, but to contain the uncontrollable spasms of his body. He murmured to himself, an uninterrupted flow of inaudible words, broken only by sudden gasps and a terrified gaze that seemed to fix on something only he could see. The entire room held its breath. It was living proof of Donna Ilara's prophecy, the manifestation of the forest's justice. The defense lawyers, with rehearsed gravity, presented the psychiatric report. The young millionaire, they argued, was irremediably insane, his mind shattered by the trauma of the encounter with the predator. Not an ordinary predator, but a mythical entity, a justice tiger that, though invisible to science, had manifested so realistically in his psyche that it had led to his complete disintegration. The strategy was clear: legal insanity. He could not be judged for his actions, for his mind had already been condemned by a greater force. The prosecutor stood, his voice firm despite the knot in his stomach. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice echoing in the tense silence, "we cannot allow a man's convenient madness to serve as a shield for the brutality of his crimes. This man, in his arrogance and cruelty, tied a defenseless elderly woman and her dog to train tracks. This man, in his sanity, planned and executed an act of malice that shocked us all. The presence of an animal, real or imaginary, does not erase responsibility for these heinous actions." He tried to bring the discussion back to the facts, to the forensic evidence, to the testimonies of the police officers who found the scene. But every word seemed to fight against the current of a narrative that had already taken deep root in the collective imagination. The media, in a frenzy, broadcast every detail. Images of the catatonic millionaire, interspersed with Donna Elara's emotional testimonies, created a shocking contrast. On social media, the debate was fierce. Many saw his condition as irrefutable proof of divine intervention, a deserved punishment. Others, more skeptical, argued it was a cheap trick to escape punishment, a well-orchestrated farce. But even the skeptics could not deny the disturbing impact of the millionaire's figure, an empty shell of the man he once was. Away from the courtroom's chaos, in the comforting silence of her hospital room, Donna Elara watched the news on television, Fiel nestled at her feet. Her eyes, which had witnessed so much pain and so much miracle, reflected an imperturbable calm. She felt no joy at the young man's misfortune, nor anger, only a deep understanding. "The forest does not forgive arrogance," she murmured to Fiel, her voice soft, almost a whisper. "It merely corrects the imbalance. And sometimes the correction is more severe for the mind than for the body." Her words, even unspoken publicly, seemed to reverberate through the Guardians of the Forest movement, which gained even more strength. The protection of the forest around the tracks became a global cause, a symbol of the need for coexistence and respect. The Justice Tiger was more than a legend. It was a catalyst, a force that had exposed the fragility of human justice and the resilience of nature. The trial proceeded, but the tiger's shadow loomed over every procedure. It was not just the young millionaire who was on trial. It was society's very ability to discern truth amidst myth, to apply the law when nature had already imposed its own sentence. The tension was a taut rope, ready to snap, and everyone felt that the final verdict, whatever it might be, would echo far beyond the walls of that courtroom, redefining what justice meant in a world where savagery still had the power to roar. The taut rope of tension in the courtroom finally began to vibrate, threatening to snap. The prosecutor, exhausted but determined, made his final appeal to the jury. His voice, now hoarse, tried to pierce the mist of mysticism surrounding the case. He spoke of responsibility, of free will, of a man who, in his sanity, orchestrated an act of pure malice. He presented the forensic evidence, the police testimonies, the calculated coldness of the crime. But every word seemed to bounce off the image of the young millionaire, now a shadow of his former self, rocking in his chair, eyes lost in some invisible horror. The defense, for its part, didn't need much. It presented more psychiatric reports, testimonies from experts who described the defendant's mind as a devastated battlefield. It wasn't a convenient madness, they argued, but a psychosis induced by a traumatic event of mythical proportions. The Justice Tiger, real or imaginary, had broken the man's mind in a way that no prison or legal punishment could equal. His current condition was the sentence itself, irrefutable proof that nature, in its fury, had imposed a justice more severe than any human court could conceive. The jury, composed of ordinary citizens, felt the weight of the decision, how to judge a man who seemed to have already been judged by a greater force. How to separate the law of men from the legend that had captured the world's imagination. They retired to the deliberation room, taking with them not only the evidence, but also the echoes of the forest's roars, Donna Elara's whispers, and the disturbing image of the catatonic defendant. Hours turned into a full day of heated debates. Logic and emotion clashed. Some jurors struggled to ignore the popular narrative, focusing strictly on the facts of the crime. Others, however, could not shake the feeling that the case transcended mere jurisprudence, touching on something older and more primordial. Doubt lingered, not about the guilt of the act, but about the defendant's capacity to be held responsible for it, given his mental condition. When the verdict was finally read, the room held its breath. Not guilty by reason of insanity. A murmur erupted in the gallery, quickly muffled by the judge's gavel. The prosecutor lowered his head, a mixture of frustration and resignation on his face. The defense, though legally victorious, showed no triumph, only a somber gravity. For the young millionaire, the verdict meant nothing. He continued to murmur, his gaze fixed on a distant point, oblivious to the drama unfolding around him. The decision echoed like thunder through the city and around the world. In the streets, the reaction was mixed. Some protesters, mostly guardians of the forest, interpreted the verdict as final confirmation of nature's justice. The tiger had acted, and its intervention not only saved Donna Ilara, but also broke the villain's mind, imposing a punishment that human law could not replicate. Others, more skeptical, saw the decision as a system failure, a legal loophole, allowing a rich man to escape the consequences of his actions. But even they could not deny the millionaire's strange and disturbing transformation. The young man was sent to a maximum security psychiatric institution, a place with thick walls and barred windows, but which could not contain the demons that inhabited his mind. There, he would live out his days in perpetual torment, his own personal hell. The tiger's roar, once an external sound, was now a constant echo in his skull, the beast's sharp teeth always lurking, ready to tear apart any trace of peace. He was a prisoner of his own madness, a punishment infinitely crueler than any prison cell. Far away in the hospital, Donna Ilara received the news with the same serenity that characterized her. Feel, the stray dog, was still her shadow, a constant reminder of loyalty and resilience. She felt no triumph, no bitterness, only the confirmation of an ancient truth. The forest has its own laws, she told a nurse, her eyes wise and deep, and its justice, though mysterious, is implacable. The Guardians of the Forest movement gained unprecedented momentum. The verdict, far from diminishing the tiger's legend, solidified it. The forest around the tracks was declared an environmental protection area, a sanctuary for wildlife and a testament to nature's strength. The justice tiger became a global symbol of resistance against greed and destruction. Its physical absence only intensified its mythical presence, transforming it into an invisible guardian, a voice that roared for all those who could not defend themselves. The story had reached a turning point. Human justice had bowed to the justice of the forest. The young millionaire, though free from bars, was imprisoned in a cell of his own mind, a living monument to human arrogance and nature's retribution. And the world now listened to the whispers of the forest with renewed respect, knowing that sometimes savagery roars to be heard, and its voice, once heard, can never be forgotten. The padded cell of the maximum security psychiatric institution was the young millionaire's new kingdom. There were no bars on the windows, only shatterproof glass, but the walls, however soft, were more oppressive than any iron. Inside, the silence was broken only by his own murmurs, and for him by the incessant roar of the tiger that inhabited his mind. The predator no longer needed flesh. It fed on his fear, his guilt, every fragment of sanity he still tried to cling to. His days were a succession of terrifying visions. The tiger's flaming eyes, the sharp teeth snapping ropes, the smell of mud and blood, the distant train whistle that never arrived for him, but which always reminded him of what he had done. Doctors and nurses saw a catatonic man, sometimes agitated, other times in a state of deep stupor, his eyes fixed on an invisible point. They medicated him, tried therapies, but nothing seemed to reach the root of his torment. His fortune, once a symbol of power and freedom, was now useless. It brought no peace, nor silenced the roar. It was a cruel reminder of his arrogance. The same arrogance that had led him to the brink of the abyss and pushed him into this particular hell. His once proud parents visited him rarely, their faces etched with pain and shame. The son they knew had disappeared, replaced by an empty shell, a spectre haunted by a beast only he could see. The justice of the forest had found a form of punishment that human law could never conceive. A prison without walls, built within the culprit's own mind. Far away in her humble home, Donna Ilara recovered fully. Phil, her loyal companion, never left her side. The house, once a quiet refuge, was now a pilgrimage site. Journalists, activists, curious onlookers all sought the wisdom of the woman who had witnessed the miracle. But Donna Ilara did not revel in fame. Her voice, still soft, spoke of respect, balance, and the interconnectedness of all life. "It's not about revenge," she explained, her eyes deep and serene. "It's about remembering that we are part of something greater. The forest gives us life and demands respect in return." She became a kind of oracle, a maternal figure for the Guardians of the Forest movement, which grew exponentially. The environmental protection area around the tracks, once a place of danger and neglect, flourished. Volunteers from around the world united to reforest, monitor wildlife, and educate local communities. Signs were erected, not only warning of the presence of animals, but also telling the story of the Justice Tiger, an invisible guardian who watched over the forest and those who respected it. The legend spread, transcending borders and cultures. Books were written, documentaries produced, and the image of the tiger, once a figure of fear, became a symbol of hope and retribution. In schools, children learned about the balance of nature and the consequences of greed. In international forums, leaders discussed the urgent need to protect ecosystems, citing the Justice Tiger case as a vivid example of nature's fury when provoked. The story had become a modern myth, a parable about human arrogance and the indomitable resilience of wildlife. The Justice Tiger was no longer just an animal. It was an idea, a spirit, a constant reminder that nature has its own laws, and its justice, though mysterious, is implacable and, at times, deeper than any human verdict. The tension in the world had not disappeared, but it had transformed. It was no longer the tension of immediate fear, but the tension of responsibility. Humanity, confronted with proof that nature could retaliate in unexpected ways, began to question its own limits. The tiger's roar, though silenced for most, echoed in the hearts of those who dared to ignore the whispers of the forest. The young millionaire, in his mental cell, was the living monument to this truth, a perpetual reminder that true freedom resides not in wealth or power, but in the peace that only respect and harmony with the natural world can offer. And as the world tried to readjust to this new understanding, the forest, in its majestic silence, continued to roar, a sound that, once heard, could never be forgotten. The padded cell, a forced sanctuary, was the stage for a drama unfolding only in the young millionaire's mind. There, time was not measured by clocks, but by the endless cycles of visions and sounds that haunted him. The tiger's roar, once a distant echo from the forest, had become the very rhythm of his existence, pulsing in his veins, vibrating in his bones. It was no longer an external sound, but the distorted melody of his own madness, a symphony of guilt and terror that never ceased. He saw the beast's flaming eyes in every shadow, felt the warm breath on his neck, the sharp teeth tearing not at ropes, but at the last fibers of his sanity. The luxury of his previous life, the parties, the private jets, the accumulated fortunes, all had vanished into an irrelevant haze. His wealth, once the shield protecting him from consequences, was now a burden, a constant reminder of the arrogance that had led him to this abyss. His parents, once pillars of his world, were now distant figures, their rare visits laden with a silent pain that he, in his torment, could barely register. He was a living monument to retribution, a statue of flesh and bone erected by nature's fury. Meanwhile, the world outside continued to spin, but with a new consciousness. The story of the justice tiger had infiltrated the fabric of society, not as a fairy tale, but as a visceral truth. In schools, children drew tigers with halos, learning about the interconnectedness of life and the fragility of ecosystems. In universities, heated debates arose about environmental ethics, corporate responsibility, and nature's role as an agent of justice. The case of the millionaire and the elderly woman was no longer just a headline. It was a watershed moment, a turning point in human perception of its own place on the planet. Donna Ilara, in her humble home, became the personification of this new era. Her unwavering serenity, her soft yet firm voice, echoed the ancestral wisdom of the forest. She sought no vengeance, nor did she revel in fame. Her message was simple and profound. We are not the owners of the earth, but its guardians, and the earth, when wounded, finds its own ways to heal, to defend itself. Feel, the loyal stray dog, remained by her side, a silent symbol of loyalty and the resilience of common life. Donna Ilara's house, once an isolated refuge, transformed into a beacon, attracting pilgrims from all over the world, seeking not a miracle, but a deeper understanding. The Guardians of the Forest movement exploded on a global scale. Volunteers of all ages and nationalities converged on the environmental protection area around the tracks, transforming a site of near tragedy into a sanctuary of hope. Trees were planted, rivers were cleaned, and wildlife, once threatened, began to thrive under the watchful eye of a global community. Signs were erected not only to demarcate the area, but to narrate the legend, to ensure that the story of the tiger, the elderly woman, and the villain would never be forgotten. But the new consciousness did not come without its challenges. The tension now was not that of imminent danger, but of constant vigilance. There were those who, in their stubbornness, still resisted change, who saw environmental protection as an obstacle to progress, who tried to discredit the tiger legend as mere superstition. The forest's roar, though louder than ever, still needed to be heard above the noise of greed and indifference. Humanity, on its journey of readjustment, faced the Herculean task of unlearning centuries of arrogance and relearning humility. The justice tiger, though invisible, loomed over everything. It was no longer just an animal, but an archetype, a force of nature that had manifested to rebalance the scales. Its physical absence only intensified its mythical presence, transforming it into an eternal guardian, a constant reminder that nature has its own laws, and that its justice, though mysterious, is implacable and, at times, deeper than any human verdict. The story had become a modern myth, a living parable, and the world now lived under the shadow of its roar, a sound that once heard could never be forgotten and which demanded eternal vigilance lest the lesson be lost to time. In the padded cell, the young millionaire was a distorted echo of his past. The tiger's roar, once confined to his mind, now seemed to resonate within the very walls of the institution, a sound only he heard, but which for him was as real as the air he breathed. Every fiber of his being was a taut string, vibrating with the memory of sharp teeth, cold mud, the train whistle that never arrived for him, but which became the soundtrack to his personal hell. His eyes, once full of arrogance, now mirrored a profound emptiness, punctuated by flashes of terror. Doctors spoke of delusions, of psychosis, but for him, it was the raw truth. Nature had exacted its price, and the debt was eternal, paid with his very sanity. His fortune, once a shield, was now a burden, a constant reminder that human power was fragile before the untamed fury of the wild world. Far away, under the sun that kissed the forest, Donna Ilara was the personification of resilience. Her home, once a simple refuge, had become a sanctuary of wisdom, a beacon for the guardians of the forest movement. Feel, the loyal stray dog, was her shadow, a constant reminder of loyalty and the beauty of life in its purest form. Each day, more volunteers arrived, their hands eager to plant, their hearts open to learn. The protected area around the tracks flourished, a vibrant mosaic of green and life. Where greed had once almost claimed an existence, signs narrated the legend of the Justice Tiger, not as a fairy tale, but as a testament to nature's strength, a warning and an inspiration. But peace, like the forest, was something that demanded constant vigilance. The movement's success, the global visibility of the Justice Tiger case, attracted unwanted attention. It was no longer the eyes of a single man with his arrogance, but the cold, calculating eyes of a global conglomerate, Titan Corporate Setting, which saw in the vast protected land an unexplored potential, an obstacle to be removed in the name of progress. Rumors began to circulate about valuable mineral deposits beneath the reserve soil, about the need to expand the railway network to facilitate production outflow. The rhetoric was smooth, wrapped in promises of jobs and development, but the intention was clear: dismantle the sanctuary. The tension, once the fear of the beast or the train, transformed into a silent but fierce battle. Titan Corp's lawyers began to question the legality of the protected area, the validity of environmental studies, the very capacity of the guardians of the forest to manage such a vast ecosystem. Disinformation campaigns emerged on social media, attempting to discredit Donna Elara, painting her as a superstitious old woman and the movement as a bunch of naive idealists. The media, once fascinated by the legend, now divided, some defending nature, others echoing the narrative of inevitable progress. Donna Elara, however, was not swayed. Her serenity was her armor, her voice, her most potent weapon. In meetings with community leaders, in interviews for the international press, she spoke not of confrontation, but of balance. The forest taught us a lesson, she would say, her eyes deep and calm. It showed us it has a voice, and that voice demands respect. We cannot forget the roar. We cannot allow greed to silence the truth we learned. She mobilized the guardians, transforming them into a network of activists, scientists, lawyers, and ordinary citizens, all united by the tiger's memory and the promise of a greener future. The Justice Tiger ceased to be merely a local legend and became a global symbol of environmental resistance. Its image, once associated with fear, was now a banner of hope and determination. Children in schools worldwide drew the tiger, not as a monster, but as a guardian, a protector. The story of the millionaire and the elderly woman, of the wild animal that intervened, was retold in international forums, a visceral reminder that nature, when pushed to its limits, finds its own ways to defend itself. The struggle was complex, with no single villain to be cornered in the mud. It was a war of narratives, of laws, of hearts and minds. Titan Corp was powerful, its resources limitless, but the guardians of the forest had something money couldn't buy. The truth of a story that had changed the world. Tension hung in the air, a dense fog of uncertainty. The future of the protected area, and perhaps the future of global environmental consciousness itself, was at stake. The forest's roar, once a sound of retribution, was now a call to vigilance, a reminder that nature's justice, though implacable, demanded the eternal dedication and protection of those who had finally understood it. Humanity, on its journey of readjustment, faced the challenge of proving that the tiger's lesson would not be forgotten, that the forest's cry would not be silenced again. The dawn of that day was no ordinary dawn. It was the prelude to a battle, not with weapons, but with the faith and voice of thousands. From all corners of the world, people converged on the small clearing, on the tracks that had been the stage for a miracle. Donna Ilara's call echoed across continents, and the response was overwhelming. Buses, cars, bicycles, and many on foot, all headed for the heart of the forest, a modern pilgrimage in the name of nature. Journalists from major television networks, environmental activists, renowned scientists and ordinary citizens, all with their eyes fixed on the same goal, to defend the sanctuary. The tension was palpable, but it wasn't a paralyzing fear. It was an electric energy, a mix of hope and defiance. The guardians of the forest, led by Donna Ilara, organized the crowd with silent precision, distributing banners, water bottles, and instructions. Feel, the loyal stray dog, walked among the legs of the crowd like a furry ambassador for the cause, sensing the collective vibration. The tracks, once a symbol of danger and exploitation, now became the stage for a global declaration. Titan Corp as us, aware of the impending demonstration, did not remain passive. Helicopters bearing the corporation's logos flew over the area, their metallic noises an attempt at intimidation. Private security teams in armored vehicles positioned themselves at the property's edges, displaying a menacing presence. The bill to reclassify the area was up for a vote in Parliament that very day, and the corporation was determined to show it was in control, that the forest's voice would be silenced by its interests. Donna Ilara, standing on a small improvised platform, her fragile figure contrasting with the strength of her presence, observed the crowd. Her eyes, once witnesses to personal horror, now reflected the determination of a global movement. The sun was directly overhead, and the heat was intense, but no one moved. The wait was part of the strategy, a test of resilience. Then the news arrived, whispered from mouth to mouth. Amplified by journalists' microphones, the parliamentary vote was about to begin. It was the moment. Donna Ilara raised her hands, and an almost reverent silence fell over the crowd. Her voice, calm and firm, resonated. They think they can silence us. They think money can buy the earth's silence, but the earth has a voice, and today we are that voice. At the exact moment she finished speaking, a distant, deep, unmistakable roar cut through the air. It was not an echo, not a memory. It was real. The crowd trembled, a mix of astonishment and reverence. Journalists, previously focused on Donna Ilara, turned their cameras towards the dense forest from which the sound came. Titan Corp. His security guards looked confused, some even frightened. The roar repeated closer, and then, between the trees, a striped shadow moved, the Justice Tiger. It emerged from the foliage not with aggression, but with silent majesty. Its amber, penetrating eyes swept the scene. It was not a hallucination, not a legend told on the wind. It was there, visible to all. The tiger walked slowly towards the tracks, stopping a few meters from the line where Titan Corp. Security guards were positioned. It didn't attack, didn't growl again. It just stood there, an imposing presence, a guardian of flesh and blood. The message was undeniable. Nature was present, and it would not be ignored. The tiger's appearance was the catalyst. Cameras from around the world captured the moment. The roar that followed was not that of the animal, but of the crowd, a cry of hope and solidarity that echoed through the forest and across news channels. The parliamentary vote, broadcast live, was interrupted by live images of the tiger on the tracks. Global pressure was instantaneous and overwhelming. In a matter of minutes, Titan Corp.'s narrative crumbled. How could they argue for progress and development when nature itself, in its wildest and most iconic form, manifested against them? The image of the tiger, a symbol of resistance, shamed the corporation on a global scale. Titan Corp.'s stock plummeted. Investors withdrew their support. Politicians, fearing voter retaliation and international condemnation, backed down. The proposed bill was unanimously rejected. Not only that, but new legislation was proposed, aimed at strengthening and expanding the protected area, transforming it into a World Heritage Site with the Justice Tiger as its official symbol. Titan Corp was forced to withdraw, not just from the region, but from similar projects worldwide, its reputation in tatters, cornered in the mud of public opinion and legal consequences. Nature's justice had, once again, broken the ropes of greed. Far away in the padded cell, the young millionaire, oblivious to the forest's victory, continued to hear the roar. But now, the sound was not just that of his torment. It was the sound of truth, of the indomitable force he had underestimated, an eternal reminder that, against nature, human arrogance is merely a whisper carried by the wind. Donna Elara, with Feel at her feet, watched the tiger turn and disappear as silently as it had appeared, back into the forest's protection. The struggle had not been easy, but the tiger's lesson had been learned. Humanity, finally, understood that coexistence was not an option, but a necessity. The forest's roar now was no longer a sound of retribution, but a hymn of hope, a reminder that nature's justice, when heard, can save not only a life, but the entire world, and the legend of the Justice Tiger would live forever, a beacon of respect and balance for future generations.